Greetings everyone and welcome to today's workshop, Implicit Bias in the Classroom. First, a bit about me, the disembodied voice who will be presenting this workshop. I am Dr. Jessica Masterson and I'm a former middle school English teacher, and now in my university role, I study secondary literacy settings, democratic education, and critical pedagogy. I also identify as a queer person of color, though I am often coded as white, and therefore I have white privilege in many settings, and it's important for me to acknowledge that. For our time together today, here's what you can expect. First, I want us all to be able to identify the concept of implicit bias and to distinguish it from terms like prejudice and racism. Of course, these are all related concepts, so I want us to understand how they work together as well. Secondly, I want us to reflect deeply on the ways implicit bias impacts our everyday classroom practice. And finally, I want us all to commit to taking action toward reducing implicit bias in our pedagogy, aka our teaching practice. So to accomplish these goals, I've organized an agenda for us. We'll begin by diving into the exigency that presages this presentation. So why are we talking about this now? Why are we as teachers talking about implicit bias? We'll then walk through some definitions together before exploring some examples of implicit bias in teaching. We'll discuss ways to reduce this bias, and we'll end with a closing reflection activity. The only materials you'll need are a writing implement of some sort, as well as a place or space to record your ideas. So this might look like a pen and paper, or you might want to open a document on your computer and jot down notes and reflections as we move through this presentation. And finally, before we get started, I want to set some norms with you all that I hope we can abide by. So under normal circumstances, I'd ask for your input in setting these norms collaboratively. But given the asynchronous format of this presentation, I've gone ahead with some norms that I hope we can all agree to. The first is to speak or write with intention. Please choose your words carefully and thoughtfully, making sure to take into account their potential impact on others. Secondly, please listen with close, careful, and loving attention both to me, your presenter, and your colleagues. If something is said that provokes a strong reaction within you, I urge you to pose a question rather than lob an accusation, for example. And finally, I expect that this presentation might make you uncomfortable. Robin DiAngelo, who is a scholar of whiteness studies, says that white folks especially have a very, very difficult time talking about race. It's uncomfortable because white folks don't have a lot of experience with talking about race and therefore do not have the grit and resilience that many people of color who cannot escape talking about race and thinking about race on the daily have developed. So DiAngelo says we have to push past that fragility in order to engage productively in conversations about race. So in other words, I'm asking us all to commit to embracing cognitive dissonance, that phenomenon that occurs when you learn something that immediately contradicts your previous worldview. So rather than rejecting the new information outright, instead sit with it. Dr. Cornel West talks about it using a different concept. He says that when we talk about prejudice and exclusion, we often talk about it in a deodorized way, a way that removes the funk. And the funk, he says, refers to the wounds, scars, and bruises that marginalized folks have experienced and continue to experience owing to legacies of exclusion and disenfranchisement. So today, let's resist the urge to deodorize this history and its legacy, and instead, let's dive head first into that funk. And just one more important note. Implicit bias crops up not just in ways related to race and racism. Of course, we also hold biases related to socioeconomic class, gender, sexuality, religion, language, national origin, ability, etc. Today, I will be talking a lot about race and racism, both because these are typically among the most difficult topics for us to address as educators, and also because from a research perspective, we know that students of color are woefully underserved by our educational institutions. Okay, so now the exigency. Why are we talking about implicit bias now? I will be the first to contend wholeheartedly that bias, prejudice, and racism are always important to discuss, always. However, given the urgency of our political moment, these take on special relevance now, heading into the school year. This summer saw a national outcry about the systemic oppression of Black Americans, particularly at the hands of police officers. And so these are some images of protests actually in Terre Haute, led by two Indiana State students, Eric Beverly on the left, and you can see Dominique Moorfield holding the George Floyd sign on the right. And perhaps some of you participated in these protests as well. So given this urgency, it's critical that we discuss this issue heading into the fall. And secondly, as I said, implicit bias is a crucial topic for educators to examine no matter what's going on nationally for several reasons. So first, though we as teachers might like to think of ourselves as above such things as racism and bias because we love our students and we care about them deeply, it is simply not true that we are above such things as racism and bias. So there's new research that backs this up. New research in the journal Educational Researcher by Chin et al. Suggests that teachers are just as biased as the general population when it comes to race. And I include myself in this alongside all of you. So we're not special just because we're teachers. Secondly, it's even more problematic that we're biased because, as it turns out, our expectations for students' academic performance is a solid predictor of their future achievement. What we think students are able to accomplish, even as early as first grade, turns out to be more or less what they end up accomplishing. So put another way, our own impressions, which are rooted in bias, of a student's academic potential are positively correlated to their actual educational attainment. So as Peterson, the lead author on one of the studies that I've hyperlinked here, puts it, students in their study benefited most academically when their teachers' implicit biases favored the ethnic group to which the student belonged. So finally, though research has shown that students of color do not, on average, misbehave more often than their white counterparts, students of color are far more likely to be disciplined for misbehavior, and this discipline is often more extreme than their white counterparts receive. We are hardwired to look to certain students and expect them to misbehave and to catch them in the act. This is called hyper-disciplining. This is Marcucci's term. And it is rooted in our own biases, and at the end of the day, it further damages students' academic outcomes. So we've talked about the why. Let's now switch gears and talk about the what. Implicit bias can be defined as the unconscious preference for one socially determined group over another. And by socially determined group, we can think about those groups that fall along lines of, for example, race, class, gender, etc. So implicit bias is distinct from prejudice. Implicit bias is a preference, whereas prejudice is a negative attitude toward a specific social group. And it's also distinct from the concept of racism, which can be defined as, first of all, having a prejudice, that negative attitude toward a specific social group, plus having the social power to act on that prejudice, whether it be as a boss, for instance, as a supervisor, etc. So prejudice plus power equals racism. Still, though these concepts are distinct, they are definitely related. Bias and prejudice are like the fuel that keeps racism going, at least on an interpersonal level. You may have heard the phrase systemic or structural racism, which calls our attention to the ways in which exclusionary practices and preferences are actually baked into social institutions and systems. So again, these are all related, though they are distinct in some pretty key ways. So I'm a metaphor person, And I think that metaphors can be super helpful in understanding complex phenomena. We've already talked about a few metaphors, so D'Angelo's metaphor of fragility and Cornel West's metaphor of the funk of our history as Americans. And as we think about racism, which as I noted, relies on bias and prejudice, I think it's important to normalize the idea that we have all internalized racist ideas. All of us, period. Whether you're a white person or a person of color, whether you're wealthy or working class, no matter where or how you were raised, you, like me, have been surrounded by racist imagery and ideology. Beverly Daniel Tatum, a critical race scholar and educator, likens racism to smog. And as she puts it, the smog of racism is sometimes so thick it is visible, we can see it, and other times it is less apparent, but always day in and day out, we are breathing it in. So acknowledging that we've breathed in this smog all of our lives is absolutely key to our work as educators. It is the first step in recognizing our own biases and ultimately correcting them. Okay, I've talked a lot at this point. So I'll ask you now to pause the recording and either think, pair, share with an elbow buddy or take a few minutes to quietly jot down your thoughts on these prompts. First, how would you define implicit bias in your own words? Secondly, what might be some ways that implicit bias on the part of the teacher might affect a child's education? Please begin. Okay, so now we've talked about the what of implicit bias. I want to turn now to the how question. How does implicit bias take shape in public education? What does it look like in practice? And I first want to share an example from my own teaching. So picture Aiea Intermediate School about 8 miles west of Honolulu on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Culturally, my students were a mixed plate, which is another lovely metaphor, quite popular in Hawaii given its ethnic diversity. So I, of course, had Native Hawaiian students as well as many others from across the Pacific. So I had Samoan students, Marshallese students, Micronesian students, Tongan students, etc. In addition, I had students whose predecessors came to the Hawaiian Islands from Japan, Korea, China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Portugal, and Puerto Rico. And as a mixed race person myself, I was thrilled to live in an environment in which cultural diversity was the rule and not the exception. I taught English language arts to 7th and 8th graders here, and I wanted to give my students as much cultural capital as I could. I wanted them to be able to navigate the culture of power that they would enter into, to borrow Lisa Delpit's words. And so one way I did this was through teaching my students about art. Every Monday, I designed a journal prompt for my students based on some famous piece of artwork. I wanted to teach them about different art movements and artists. I wanted them to engage critically with these pieces. So, for example, we discussed, of course, Da Vinci's Mona Lisa, the likes of Renoir, the beautiful photorealism of John Singer Sargent and Norman Rockwell. We discussed the Cubists' effort to more fully capture a three-dimensional reality on a two-dimensional plane. And then one day, I showed my students this image by Paul Gauguin. Now, if you don't know much about Paul Gauguin, what's relevant to the story is that he was a white French painter who gained fame by traveling throughout the Pacific Islands and depicting life among the folks he encountered there. So though his work is beautiful, it has also been critiqued, given that these images promoted some negative stereotypes of intellectual simplicity and laziness that took root among much of the Western world. So a foreigner's reductive view of these groups of people suddenly became the only view of them. And I wanted my 7th and 8th graders, this was quite a lofty goal, but many of them were members of the cultural groups that Gauguin sought to portray. And I wanted them to unpack this complicated history, to critique it. And instead, when we went around the room to share our thoughts, my student, Kaylee, I will never forget it, just sighed and said, well, I think it's just cool to see some people who look like we do. That comment stuck like a knife in my heart, and I suddenly realized that despite my best efforts, and despite the fact that I am a person of color who explicitly majored in comparative racial formations in the US in college, I had portrayed to my students a very culturally homogenous view of the entire art world. Okay, let's pause again. I want you to turn again to a partner or return to your jottings and reflect on these questions. First of all, where do we see implicit bias playing out in this example? If you were the teacher, what would you do based on that comment? And what changes, if any, would you make moving forward? Okay, begin and feel free to pause this until you're ready to continue. Okay, welcome back. So I've shared with you one possible example of what implicit bias in teaching can look like, but importantly, there are many different forms one's bias can take. So here are a few others. Implicit bias can look like assuming students from different racial or ethnic or economic backgrounds will have different academic abilities or ambition. So i.e., oh, so-and-so got a C, that's really high for this student, or that's a good grade for this student, right? Whereas we have other students who would never settle less than for an A. Implicit bias can also look like expecting students who speak in accented English to be poor writers, right? Again, that's not necessarily true. And implicit bias can look like treating students with physical disabilities as if they have mental disabilities. These are just a few examples, and I've linked here a list and more information about implicit bias from the Poorvu Center for Teaching and Learning at Yale University. And then Jill Suddy brings us an example, and she's a psychologist. So this is an anecdote of hers. She writes, "A friend of mine recently told me about an incident involving students at Berkeley High School. On the first day of classes, African-American juniors and seniors were being asked by their honors course teacher to show him their schedule when they entered the classroom. The teacher, who was white, apparently assumed the black students were lost and in the wrong room, and his gesture made them feel unwelcome and humiliated." Here's another example I witnessed this last year. Students in a 4th grade classroom were learning about the first Thanksgiving. The teacher consistently used the pronoun we to refer to European colonists while using the pronoun they to refer to Indigenous Americans. Pause for a moment, and you don't have to write anything down unless you'd like to, but just pause and reflect. Speaking about European colonists as we and Indigenous Americans as they, what does that language convey about who belongs in the classroom? Also, how is this an example of implicit bias? Let's just pause for a moment and consider that. So my thoughts on this example are firstly that this teacher centered European heritage as the norm. She created an in-group by referring to the colonists as we, as in all of us. And she created an out-group by excluding Native Americans as they. Imagine how students of color felt in the classroom and how students with Indigenous heritage felt. So though perhaps unwitting, this teacher's implicit bias reinforced the notion that to belong in the classroom, to be part of the we, you had to be white. So again, these examples I've shared are really just the tip of the iceberg. Assuming that we've all breathed in the smog of racism our entire lives, and that our actions may implicitly reflect that smog, I'd like to pose some questions to you all now. These are ones that your facilitator may choose to ask you to reflect on individually right now, perhaps in writing, or they may be questions that you let sink in and examine on your own as you head into the classroom. Importantly, there is no end place that you'll arrive where you no longer have to think about implicit bias. Rather, this reflection should be one you return to periodically. If you do not already keep a journal about your teaching experiences, I highly suggest you start one. And these questions can serve as prompts. So as I read through these questions, think of your own classroom practice, or if you're a pre-service teacher, reflect on perhaps classrooms that you've been a part of or classrooms that you've observed, and respond to these questions in your mind as openly and as honestly as you can. First, who is represented in my curriculum? Who is not? Is my classroom inclusive? Who do I call on most often? Who do I discipline most often? To whom do I most often give the benefit of the doubt? And how can I cultivate cross-group friendships so that my own perspectives are not an echo chamber? If your facilitator would like, they may now pause the presentation for your individual reflection time. Okay, so at this point, we've accomplished a lot in our brief time together. We've talked about the why of learning about implicit bias, as well as the what and the how. And now it's time to take action. And the first step that you can take is to become aware of your biases, to accept that, yes, you got them, we've all got them, and to name them. There are several ways that you can identify your own biases. Reflection and journaling are one way. Regularly engaging in conversations about bias and difference with colleagues and friends across lines of difference is another. And Harvard University, in partnership with Yale, the University of Virginia, and the University of Washington, has put together a series of implicit association tests, or IATs they call them, that measure implicit bias across a wide range of categories, including race, gender, body weight, religion, and disability, and many, many, many others. So you are welcome. Anyone can take these IATs, and after engaging in the brief activity, usually doesn't take more than 10 or 15 minutes, you will see some results. They will let you know about biases that you have, which groups you tend to favor over the others. And so I promise you that if you engage in this exercise as fully and openly as possible, this can be another way to get a hold of your biases such that you can work to lessen them. And the work of lessening them is not a one-time project, it is continual. Think of it as a continual cycle in which we must dialogue with others who do not look like us, including, of course, students and their families. We must then reflect on what we've learned through this dialogue and then take action based on this reflection. So to this one, I want to share what I think will be the final metaphor with you all. And this one comes from Russian critical theorist Mikhail Bakhtin. And Bakhtin was big into dialogue. That was his thing, you could say. And he likened dialogue to a dinner table. So imagine sitting at this dinner table with people. Maybe you know them well, maybe you all just met. In either case, from your vantage, you and your dinner guests can agree on the existence of multiple things. We can all see, for instance, glasses with varying levels of liquid. We can see plates and serving bowls. We can see each other. But looking to the woman directly across from you, you are able to see a lot that she can't. The wood paneled wall behind her, for instance, the hutch. You're even able to see what the back of her chair looks like. And she, too, can see all that is behind you right now that you are not able to see. So Bakhtin says that our experience, our view is limited. We can only see what we can see, and there's a lot that we can't see. But dialogue, the act of talking, conversing, discussing, that's how we help each other fill in the gaps in our understanding of reality and what we see. Dialogue is how we can know what it is that we aren't seeing. So I urge you all in your work to bring this principle of dialogue into your daily educational practice as a means of reducing implicit bias. And finally, I wanted to circle back to the example I shared of my own teaching. I asked you to weigh in on how you would approach the issue I presented when Kaylee pointed out to me that I had been excluding artwork by and featuring people of color. So here's what I decided to do. After getting over that initial shock and shame, I asked my students instead to supply pieces of art or quotes or songs. They also supplied me with the prompts. And the works they chose ranged widely and represented not only their cultural backgrounds, but also their concerns, like militarization. If you know anything about Hawaii, you might know that it's filled with many, many military bases. There's a lot of land that you can't access unless you're a member of the military. I was just beyond Pearl Harbor when I was teaching in Hawaii, and you could hear military helicopters go overhead throughout the day. So one student wanted to reflect on the military and get some advice and some perspectives from her fellow students about it. And of course, 7th and 8th graders are really emotional and they love to talk about love. So sometimes their facilitations were about quotes that their peers actually said. So some, of course, just chose to facilitate conversations in the way that I had been doing previously, but in all cases, I tried through dialogue, through reflection, and ultimately action to correct this bias. And in so doing, I was able to give my students much more of a voice in the classroom. Now I'd like you to spend the last few minutes we have together completing this exit ticket. It will be up to your facilitator whether they'd like to collect these or not. And as a way to wrap up what we've discussed today, please take some time to reflect on the following questions. First of all, what are some ways you might work to actively identify and overcome implicit bias in your work as a teacher? If/when you are called out, perhaps by a student, perhaps by a parent, perhaps by a colleague, on an implicit bias, how will you respond? And finally, what is one question about this topic that you'd like to discuss further? Please begin. Thank you all for your time and attention today. So there is a wealth of resources out there on the topic of implicit bias in education, and here are just a few. I've also hyperlinked all of my sources throughout this presentation so you can continue learning. Thank you all for your time and attention. Again, cheers everyone.